9 p.m. Cape Canaveral, Florida. A rocket 320 feet tall is bolted to its launch pad, engines firing, not going anywhere, just being tested. And then, in a matter of seconds, it is gone. Not a malfunction on the way to orbit, not a failure in deep space. Gone right there, on the ground, in front of everyone, in a fireball that turned the Florida sky orange and rattled windows across the beach. What exploded that night was not just a rocket, it was 24 satellite launches for Amazon, instantly frozen. It was NASA's moon program, suddenly missing one of its two pillars. It was the only launch pad Blue Origin had gone, possibly for years. And somewhere behind all of it, the biggest question spaceflight has faced in a decade: if this is what one bad test does, how fragile is everything we have built up there and down here in the dark? If this kind of story is what you come here for, the real ones, the ones that actually happened last week, then liking and subscribing is the simplest way to tell me to keep making them. Something about knowing you're here makes the work feel worth it. Get somewhere comfortable now. In 3, 2, 1, liftoff. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a Florida beach town after sunset in late May. The day trippers are gone, the restaurants are winding down, the sea breeze comes in soft and warm off the Atlantic, and the only thing the people of Cocoa Beach really expect to hear is the occasional rumble of surf and the distant sound of traffic on the coastal highway. At 9 o'clock in the evening on May the 28th, 2026, that quiet ended. Windows rattled, walls shook. People who were already in bed sat straight up. People who were still outside on their porches or walking their dogs spun around and looked south. And what they saw, what hundreds of people recorded on their phones in the next few seconds and posted to the internet almost immediately, was a sky on fire. Not metaphorically, a real, roiling, orange fireball erupting from the shoreline, climbing into the darkness over Cape Canaveral, and casting the whole horizon in shades of amber and red that do not normally come from Florida at 9 p.m. on a warm spring night. Social media filled within minutes. People used words like earthquake before they realized what they were seeing. Someone posted a photograph of the glow reflecting off the water. Someone else posted a video from their car, pulled over on the side of A1A, the coastal road that runs along the beach, with the fireball clearly visible through the windshield. Emergency switchboards lit up. Residents wanted to know if they needed to evacuate. Authorities were quick to clarify that there was no threat to the public. The fumes were not dangerous. The debris would stay within the facility. But the rocket was gone. The rocket's name was New Glenn. It was built by Blue Origin, the spaceflight company founded by Jeff Bezos, the man who created Amazon and who has, for the better part of 2 decades, been quietly and methodically building one of the most ambitious private space programs on Earth. New Glenn was the jewel of that program. It was Blue Origin's first, and, at the time of the explosion, only rocket capable of reaching orbit, capable of going all the way up, punching through the atmosphere, and delivering a payload into the cold dark of space, rather than just hopping up and coming back down. It stood approximately 320 feet tall. If you placed it next to the Statue of Liberty, the rocket would be nearly twice her height. It was wide enough, 7 meters across, or roughly 23 feet, that several cars could park side by side across its base. It burned liquid methane and liquid oxygen in a cluster of 7 massive engines at its base, engines so powerful that 7 of them together could generate approximately 3.8 million pounds of force, pushing upward in a single roaring second. Its reusable first stage had already survived 2 successful landings on a barge at sea. Its third flight, in April 2026, had not gone perfectly. The second stage had failed to reach its intended orbit, but the first stage had landed safely, and engineers had been working through that problem, preparing for the next mission. That next mission was supposed to happen around June the 4th, just days away. It was going to carry 48 satellites for Amazon's LEO broadband constellation into orbit. No satellites were aboard during the test. That much was confirmed immediately. No one was hurt. That was confirmed within the hour. Jeff Bezos posted on the social media platform X that all Blue Origin personnel were accounted for and safe, and he wrote, "Very rough day, but we'll rebuild whatever needs rebuilding and get back to flying." The engineers on the ground that night had cleared the pad before the test, as they always do, standard procedure. The pad is never occupied by people when the engines fire, but the pad itself and everything attached to it was not so fortunate. To understand what happened that evening, you have to understand what a static fire test actually is, because the name is slightly misleading. It sounds quiet. It sounds careful. A static fire, after all, something that is not going anywhere. And that is technically true. During a static fire test, the rocket is fully fueled, fully pressurized, and locked down to the launch pad by enormous hold-down bolts. The engines ignite. They fire at full or near full power. And then, after a brief burn, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes up to half a minute, the engines shut down. The vehicle stays on the pad, and engineers spend the next hours and days analyzing every sensor reading, every pressure trace, every temperature measurement to confirm that the vehicle is healthy and ready to fly for real. The point of a static fire test is to find problems before you commit to an actual launch. It is a dress rehearsal for the most violent and energetic event that human beings regularly orchestrate. It is one of the last major opportunities to discover that something is wrong before you put a satellite worth hundreds of millions of dollars or a crew of astronauts on top of a column of controlled explosion and send it away from Earth. Every major rocket program does it. SpaceX does it before Falcon 9 missions. NASA did it before Space Shuttle launches. Static fire tests have an excellent track record. The vast majority of them go exactly as planned. But here is what a static fire test cannot escape. No matter how carefully it is planned, the rocket sitting on that pad is still a rocket. It is still full of propellants, so volatile and so energetic that their only intended purpose is to release enormous quantities of force in a controlled burn. When that control fails, when something in the engine or the plumbing or the pressurization system or any one of thousands of individual components that must all work correctly at exactly the right moment goes wrong, the result is not a gentle shutdown. The result is what the people of Cocoa Beach saw on the evening of May the 28th, 2026. New Glenn 7B4 engines, Blue Origin's flagship engines, methane-burning giants that each produce approximately 640,000 pounds of thrust, were beginning to fire at approximately 9 p.m. Engineers were counting down toward a planned hot fire burn. Something went wrong at the base of the rocket. Eyewitnesses and video footage show a rapidly growing fire at the bottom of the first stage, followed almost immediately by the upper stage, tilting the 86-foot-tall second stage, beginning to lean as the first stage beneath it started to lose structural integrity. And then, within seconds, the entire vehicle detonated. The first stage is enormous tanks of liquid methane and liquid oxygen, fuels that must be stored at extraordinarily cold temperatures. Methane at approximately -260 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid oxygen at approximately -297 degrees Fahrenheit. Both kept that way because at room temperature, they boil off into gas and cannot be stored. Those tanks ruptured and ignited in a single catastrophic event that produced the fireball visible from the beach. The rocket was destroyed completely. The launch pad, Launch Complex 36, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, the only operational orbital launch pad Blue Origin possessed, was severely damaged. The erector gantry, the massive structure used to move New Glenn from its hangar to the pad and raise it to the vertical position, was gone. A nearby facility also sustained damage. Blue Origin issued a warning in the days that followed that debris from the explosion might wash ashore on nearby beaches, and so it did. People walking the beach in the days after May the 28th found pieces of it at the waterline. NASA's administrator, Jared Isaacman, was among the first officials to respond publicly, writing that spaceflight is unforgiving and that developing new heavy lift launch capability is extraordinarily difficult. He said the agency would work with its partners to support a thorough investigation and assess near-term mission impacts. That language, near-term mission impacts, was careful and measured in the way that official statements always are. What it meant, underneath the carefully chosen words, was something considerably more alarming, because this was not just Blue Origin's bad night. This was a detonation that sent a shockwave through the entire American space program, through NASA's plans to return humans to the moon, through Amazon's satellite internet ambitions, through the careers and timelines of everyone who had built their next several years around New Glenn, doing what it was supposed to do. And to understand exactly how far that shockwave traveled, you first have to understand what was sitting on that launch pad. Not just the rocket, but everything the rocket represented. What it was supposed to carry, what it was supposed to build, what it was supposed to prove. Because the loss of New Glenn that night was not the loss of one vehicle. It was the sudden, violent removal of a load-bearing pillar from a structure that a great many important things were leaning on. In the weeks and months before the explosion, Blue Origin had been building towards something remarkable. The company had conducted 3 New Glenn launches since the rocket's debut in January 2025. The first 2 had been largely successful. The third, in April 2026, had been a partial success, at best. The first stage had landed on the barge as planned, but the second stage had failed to reach its intended orbit, and the FAA had opened an investigation. Blue Origin was working through the findings from that mission, preparing for the 4th launch. It was a company still in the early chapters of its orbital story, still building experience and credibility with each flight, still demonstrating to NASA and to the commercial market that New Glenn was reliable, that it could do what it promised. The 4th mission was going to be a statement. 48 Amazon LEO satellites, the first of 24 planned New Glenn launches that Amazon had booked, the opening chapter of a broadband internet constellation designed to compete directly with SpaceX's Starlink network from orbit. Beyond that, Blue Origin held a $3.4 billion contract from NASA to build the Blue Moon Lunar Lander, a vehicle designed to return American astronauts to the surface of the moon as part of the Artemis program. The Blue Moon lander launches on New Glenn. It cannot launch on anything else. Blue Origin also had plans for a Moonbase 1 mission, a crewed demonstration flight in low Earth orbit, and participation in Artemis 3 and Artemis 4. All of it was stacked on the same foundation. All of it required New Glenn flying reliably from Launch Complex 36. And now Launch Complex 36 was a ruin. Now New Glenn's next flight had no date. Now the launch pad that everything depended on would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, and according to NASA Administrator Isaacman, speaking to CNBC a few days after the explosion, that rebuild could take until 2028. He said it plainly, without drama, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering genuinely difficult news. 2028 was within the realm of a possible recovery timeline, and the situation would take some serious time. 2 years, possibly 2 years, before a single New Glenn rocket could lift off from Cape Canaveral again. Jeff Bezos, for his part, wrote on X, "It's too early to know the root cause, but we're already working to find it." On June the 3rd, 6 days after the explosion, Blue Origin vowed publicly to resume New Glenn flights by the end of 2026. That vow seemed, to many observers, ambitious at best. Blue Origin's only operational launch site was wreckage. Its second launch pad, under development at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, was still months or more away from operational status. And unlike SpaceX, which had multiple launch complexes on both coasts and could absorb a single pad failure without stopping flights, Blue Origin had nowhere else to go. The shockwave was still spreading, and it had only just begun. To fully understand what happened that night, not just the political and commercial consequences, but the actual physical event, you have to sit with the scale of what a modern rocket carries in its tanks, and what happens when that energy is released incorrectly. Think of it this way. Every time a rocket launches successfully, what you are watching is a controlled catastrophe. It is an explosion so precisely managed, so carefully shaped by engineering, that it produces thrust rather than chaos. The engines burn, the vehicle accelerates, the forces are directed downward, and the rocket goes up. It works. Millions of times worth of engineering went into making it work, and on most launch days, it does. But the fuel itself, the propellants, do not know they are supposed to behave. They are not inherently cooperative. They are extraordinarily energetic chemical systems stored under pressure at cryogenic temperatures in tanks that must be perfectly sealed and perfectly managed from the moment fueling begins to the moment the engines shut down. New Glenn's first stage carried liquid methane and liquid oxygen. These are the same propellants used by SpaceX's Raptor engines in Starship. The choice of the next generation of large rockets, selected because methane burns more cleanly than traditional kerosene, leaves less residue in the engine, and is a better candidate for eventual production on Mars using local resources. But methane and liquid oxygen, in the quantities required to fly a rocket of New Glenn's size, represent an energy store of almost incomprehensible magnitude. The 7B4 engines together produce approximately 3.8 million pounds of thrust, enough, if released all at once in the wrong direction, to level structures for a significant distance around the pad. A static fire test puts all of that energy into motion. The tanks are filled, the system is pressurized, the engines begin to ignite, and the vehicle is expected to hold together, absorb all of that force in a structured and controlled way, and then stop when commanded. When something in that chain fails, when a seal gives way or a valve malfunctions, or a pressure trace goes wrong. At a critical moment, the propellants do what propellants do when they are released suddenly from containment near an ignition source. They go boom, not gently, not in a way that gives engineers time to shut the system down. The chain of events from first failure to total detonation can unfold in well under a second. And at the scale of New Glenn, 320 feet tall, 7 engines, tanks that dwarf anything you would see in a gas station or an industrial facility. A failure of that kind produces what residents of Cocoa Beach experienced at 9 p.m. on May the 28th. A concussive shockwave through the ground, an orange sky, a sound that people later described as thunder but louder, closer, and wrong. No one was inside the danger zone when it happened. That part of the protocol held, and for that, Blue Origin and every safety engineer who designed their procedures deserves genuine credit. In the history of rocket testing, not every company has been so fortunate. The decision to clear the pad before engine ignition to make that specific area a human-free zone during the most dangerous phase of a ground test is the reason that the explosion of May the 28th destroyed hardware and infrastructure, but not people. Blue Origin called it, in their initial statement, simply an anomaly. That word, anomaly, is the favored term in the aerospace industry for events ranging from a minor sensor glitch to the total destruction of a vehicle on the launch pad. It is deliberately neutral. It does not assign blame. It does not foreclose any hypothesis. It acknowledges that something went wrong without specifying what. The FAA confirmed they were aware of the incident, noted that the test was not within the scope of FAA-licensed activities, and confirmed there was no impact to air traffic. The investigation into the root cause, as of the date of this script, was ongoing. No cause had been officially confirmed. What had been confirmed was everything else. The rocket was gone. The pad was gone. And the question of what happens next for Blue Origin, for Amazon, for NASA, and for America's moon program was one that everyone who depended on New Glenn was now being forced to confront. The night of May the 28th, 2026 was not the first time a rocket exploded at Cape Canaveral during a routine ground test. It was not the first time a company found itself staring at a destroyed launch pad and an empty manifest and a press statement to write. And it was not the first time that an explosion on the ground, not in the air, not in space, not during the violent ascent phase that most people associate with rocket disasters, turned out to carry far larger consequences than an equivalent explosion in flight might have. To understand why, you have to understand the particular cruelty of a launch pad explosion. When a rocket fails in flight, the vehicle is gone and the payload is gone. That is devastating. But the launch pad itself typically survives. The infrastructure, the concrete, the steel, the fuel lines, the support systems, the gantry remains intact. Engineers can study the telemetry, identify the problem, fix it, build a new rocket, bring it to the same pad, and fly again. The pad is the house. The rocket is temporary furniture. Lose the furniture and the house is still there. But when a rocket fails on the ground, when the full load of propellant detonates at 0 altitude, with the vehicle still attached to everything, the pad is the thing that gets consumed. The full energy of the explosion, which in flight would be distributed across thousands of feet of altitude and directed mostly upward, is instead concentrated at ground level, directed outward in every direction, and absorbed by the concrete, the steel, the plumbing, the systems that took years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build in precisely the right configuration to serve precisely this rocket. launch pads are not generic. They are custom structures, engineered specifically for the vehicle they support. The water deluge systems, the flame trench that channels the engine exhaust, the electrical umbilicals that connect the rocket to ground systems, the fueling lines that carry cryogenic propellants at the right temperature and pressure, all of it is specific to New Glenn. None of it can be swapped out for an off-the-shelf replacement. It all has to be rebuilt carefully and correctly before a single new rocket can sit on that pad and be asked to fly. This is what makes a pad explosion uniquely damaging in a way that an in-flight failure is not. The closest recent parallel in American spaceflight happened exactly 10 years before, almost to the day in terms of where it occurred, if not the calendar. On September 1st, 2016, at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, just a few miles north of where New Glenn would eventually be lost, a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket exploded during preparations for a routine static fire test. The rocket had been loaded with its propellants and was sitting on the pad approximately 8 minutes from the planned engine ignition when a large breach in the cryogenic helium pressurization system of the second stage caused a catastrophic failure. The resulting explosion destroyed the Falcon 9 and its payload, a nearly $200 million Israeli communications satellite called Amos-6, which was mounted on top of the rocket for what was intended to be a mock countdown rather than an actual flight. No one was injured. The pad was clear, but Space Launch Complex 40 was put out of commission, and it would not fly another SpaceX mission for 15 months. 15 months. That is how long it took to rebuild a SpaceX launch pad after an explosion that, while devastating, was still smaller in scale than what happened to Blue Origin's Launch Complex 36. The Falcon 9, fully fueled, is a smaller vehicle than New Glenn, carrying less propellant, producing less thrust. The 2016 explosion was severe. The 2026 explosion was by multiple accounts in a different category entirely. In fact, some observers, including space historians who tracked the event, characterized the New Glenn explosion as potentially the most powerful rocket explosion since the Soviet Union's N-1 moon rocket disaster of July 3rd, 1969. That characterization should be understood as a strong assessment rather than a precisely measured scientific claim. The exact energy yield of the New Glenn explosion has not been formally published, but the comparison itself is worth sitting with because the N-1 disaster remains one of the most extraordinary events in the entire history of spaceflight, and understanding it places the scale of what happened in Cape Canaveral on May 28, 2026 into a perspective that the word anomaly cannot quite capture. The Soviet N-1 was their moon rocket, their answer to the American Saturn V, the vehicle that was supposed to carry Soviet cosmonauts to the lunar surface before the Americans could get there. It was a monster, nearly 350 feet tall, 30 engines in its first stage alone, a vehicle so massive and so complex that even by the standards of the space race, it was considered audacious. And it was rushed. The Soviet space program, pressured by Cold War competition and starved of the resources and development time that NASA enjoyed, pushed the N-1 toward flight before the engineering was truly ready. The second launch attempt, on the night of July 3rd, 1969, just 16 days before Apollo 11 would land on the moon, lifted off from the Baikonur launch complex in what was then Soviet Kazakhstan. It cleared the tower. It climbed approximately 200 meters. And then, as its 31st stage engines struggled with the vibration and instability that had plagued the program from the start, a foreign object believed to be a loose bolt was sucked into one of the fuel pumps. The pump exploded. The engines shut down. The N1, still fully loaded with nearly 2,000 tons of propellant, tilted and fell back onto its own launch pad. The explosion that followed was enormous. Debris was scattered as far as 6 miles away. Windows were shattered for miles in every direction. Light from the detonation was visible from 22 miles away. An eyewitness, a Soviet military officer present at the site, later wrote, "Today, I saw without exaggeration the end of the world, and not in a nightmare, but while fully awake and standing right next to it. The blast is estimated, based on the propellant mass involved, to have released energy roughly equivalent to approximately 7 kilotons of TNT. To put that number in context, that is approximately half the yield of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed not just the rocket, but the entire launch pad, cratered the concrete beneath it, and set back the Soviet lunar program by years. The Soviet government did not acknowledge the N1 program publicly for 2 decades. The explosion was hidden behind silence and state secrecy, and the United States, tracking Soviet activities from spy satellites, became aware of the disaster, partly because of the scale of damage, visible even from orbit. The N1 never flew successfully. All 4 of its launch attempts ended in destruction. The Soviet crewed moon landing program was abandoned. Now, the New Glenn explosion on May the 28th, 2026, did not fall from 200 meters. It was a ground explosion, a vehicle that never left the pad. The propellant load was smaller than the N1's. The scale different, the era different, the context entirely different. No one died, no moon race hung in the immediate balance in the same way. But the comparison to the N1 was not offered casually or without basis. The shared thread between them, between the N1 of 1969 and the New Glenn of 2026, is the particular vulnerability that all rockets share when they are sitting on the ground, fully fueled, and something goes wrong. They do not fail gracefully. They fail completely, and they fail outward. To understand why this is, you have to let go of the mental image of a rocket as a sturdy, solid machine. A fully fueled rocket on a launch pad is better understood as a very precisely engineered container for an enormous amount of barely managed energy. The engineering is extraordinary. The tolerances are incredibly tight. The materials are carefully chosen. The systems are redundant. But what is inside the tanks, the propellants themselves, is indifferent to all of that engineering. Liquid methane burns. Liquid oxygen supports combustion with tremendous enthusiasm. At the temperatures and pressures involved in a fully loaded rocket, any failure of containment that exposes these propellants to each other in the presence of an ignition source, which the engines themselves are, during a hot fire test, can produce a detonation rather than a controlled burn. The difference between a controlled burn and a detonation is the difference between a campfire and a bomb. A controlled burn releases energy over time in a direction you have chosen, at a rate you can manage. A detonation releases energy all at once, in all directions, at a rate that no structure can withstand. When a rocket engine is burning properly, the combustion is controlled fuel and oxidizer meet in the combustion chamber in carefully calibrated quantities, and the resulting gases are directed out the nozzle. When containment fails and the propellants mix in a way that was not designed in a fuel line, in a tank, in the space around the engine, the result is not a combustion. It is a rapid and total release of chemical energy. It is, in the most literal physical sense, an explosion. This is why so much of the engineering in a modern rocket is devoted to the systems that keep things separated, pressurized, and within acceptable parameters: the valves, the sensors, the plumbing, the pressurization systems, the thermal management that keeps cryogenic propellants at the temperatures they need to be. And this is why a failure in any one of those systems at the wrong moment can cascade almost instantaneously into total loss. In the SpaceX Falcon 9 explosion of 2016, the chain started with a breach in a helium pressurization vessel inside the second stage's liquid oxygen tank. The helium was there to keep the propellant tanks structurally sound as fuel burned during flight. The vessels containing it were pressurized to approximately 5,500 pounds per square inch. When one of them failed, the rapid expansion of high-pressure gas into the liquid oxygen caused what engineers call a rapid unplanned disassembly, a term that means exactly what you think it means, only worse and faster. The whole sequence from first failure to total loss played out in under 100 milliseconds, less than a tenth of a second. The Falcon 9 and the Amos 6 satellite went from a rocket sitting on a pad to a fireball to a debris field in the time it takes a human being to blink. Elon Musk described it at the time as the most difficult and complex failure we have ever had in 14 years. And SpaceX had by that point survived the total loss of a Falcon 9 in flight, the partial failure of other missions, and years of punishing development work. They knew failure. This particular failure, a ground explosion during what was supposed to be a routine pre-launch test, still managed to surprise them. The specific cause of the New Glenn explosion on May the 28th, 2026 had not been publicly confirmed at the time of this script. Blue Origin called it an anomaly. The FAA confirmed awareness of the event and noted it would not impact upcoming launches from other pads by other companies. The investigation was underway, and the full picture of what went wrong at the base of that 320-foot rocket at 9 p.m. will eventually be published in a formal accident report. What is already clear is the aftermath, and the aftermath tells you everything about the scale of what was lost. Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station was not a simple platform. It was a specialized, custom-built launch facility developed specifically for New Glenn, a facility that took years to construct, that was engineered to handle the specific propellants, pressures, and structural requirements of a 7-engine methane rocket. The water deluge system, the flame trench, the hold-down systems, the fueling infrastructure, all of it specific, none of it transferable. The erector gantry that was used to roll New Glenn out of its hangar and raise it vertically to the launch position gone in the explosion, along with the rest of the visible infrastructure at the pad. When SpaceX's pad exploded in 2016, it took 15 months to rebuild. And SpaceX, at that time, already had another operational Falcon 9 pad at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, which meant the company could resume launches from the West Coast while the Florida pad was being repaired. They returned to flight from Vandenberg in January 2017, and Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida did not resume flying Falcon 9 missions until December 2017. Blue Origin has no equivalent backup. Its second New Glenn pad, planned for Vandenberg Space Launch Complex 14, is under development and was not operational at the time of the explosion. There is nowhere else to fly New Glenn. The vehicle is too large, too specific, and too new to simply relocate to a different pad that was designed for someone else's rocket. The launch pad that exploded on May the 28th was the only one, and it may not be rebuilt and ready for another New Glenn launch until 2028, more than 2 years away. 2 years of silence from Launch Complex 36. And that silence, that 2-year gap in the launch manifest, is what connects the physics of the explosion to the human, commercial, and political consequences that followed. The fire burned for a matter of hours. The shockwave it sent through the space industry will last considerably longer. Consider, for a moment, what it actually takes to build a launch pad. Engineers begin with a flame trench, a reinforced concrete channel beneath the pad that directs the engine exhaust away from the vehicle and downward into a safe dispersion area. The concrete in a flame trench must be specially formulated to withstand temperatures that would destroy ordinary building materials. During a launch, the exhaust gases from New Glenn's 7B4 engines collectively produce millions of pounds of thrust and reach temperatures in the combustion chambers well above 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flame trench has to channel that inferno without cracking, without failing, without undermining the structural integrity of the pad above it. Rebuilding that trench after an explosion that struck from the inside from above, from the vehicle itself, is not a matter of patching concrete. It is a matter of understanding exactly what was damaged, removing what cannot be salvaged, assessing the foundation, and rebuilding from the ground up with the same exacting specifications as the original. Then there are the propellant systems, the network of pipes, valves, tanks, and pumps that deliver liquid methane and liquid oxygen from storage to the vehicle at precisely the right temperature, pressure, and flow rate. The pad-side propellant infrastructure for New Glenn had been carefully calibrated over years of testing and operation. Each component had been validated. The system had worked twice before for the first and second successful New Glenn launches. Now that system was destroyed, and replacing it required not just ordering new hardware, but revalidating every component before anything could fly again. Then there is the gantry, the mobile tower structure that gave engineers access to the rocket at every level, that carried the umbilical connections, feeding power and data and fluids from the ground systems into the vehicle. The gantry was also gone. The space flight, now coverage in the days after the explosion, quoted SpaceX Vice President Kiko Donchev, who drew on his company's experience cleaning up after its own pad explosion in 2016, describing the process in language that carries the texture of something genuinely difficult. In the initial days and weeks, you're using a scalpel, not a bulldozer. Cleanup has to be done with a sense of urgency, but extreme precision. It's literally launchpad surgery. He was describing the careful work of preserving evidence for the accident investigation, ensuring that the debris field is not simply cleared away before investigators can reconstruct what happened from physical evidence, while simultaneously beginning the long process of assessing what can be saved and what needs to be replaced. From the outside, a destroyed launchpad looks like wreckage. From the inside, from the perspective of the engineers who have to deal with it, it is a forensic scene and a construction site at the same time, subject to competing demands of urgency and precision that make the recovery slower and more careful than the public impatience around it might prefer. SpaceX's cleanup after its 2016 explosion and the engineers at Cape Canaveral had a decade of accumulated institutional knowledge about that process. Took many months before the pad was even cleared enough to assess the full scope of the damage. Actual rebuild work began after that, and the return to flight came more than a year after the explosion for a company that had another launch pad to use in the meantime. Blue Origin has no such runway. There is a phrase that gets used inside the aerospace industry, a phrase that sounds almost like a cliché until you understand what it actually means. Spaceflight is hard. Engineers say it. Mission controllers say it. Former astronauts say it in speeches. It gets printed on posters and said at conferences with a kind of affectionate understatement. But what it means, underneath the matter-of-fact delivery, is something that the fireball over Cape Canaveral on May the 28th, 2026 made viscerally, concretely clear. What it means is that the thing you are doing, putting an object into orbit, building a vehicle that can survive the thermal and mechanical violence of launch and the cold vacuum of space, requires a level of precision and reliability that has no real parallel anywhere else in human engineering. And that level of precision must be maintained, not once, but every time, across every component, in every system, at every stage of the test and launch sequence. Because the one time it is not the one valve, the one seal, the one pressure reading that goes wrong at the wrong moment, is the night the sky over the beach turns orange and homes shake and another rocket is gone. Space is not uniquely cruel, but it is unambiguously honest. It reveals the weakness in the system always, and it does so completely. There are no partial failures on the launch pad at 9 p.m. There is the controlled burn, or there is the fireball. The engineering holds, or it does not. The N1 never held. 4 attempts, 4 disasters. The Soviet lunar program did not survive it. The Falcon 9's 2016 explosion was devastating. SpaceX survived it, rebuilt, and flew more missions the following year than they had in any previous year. Blue Origin's New Glenn explosion on May the 28th, 2026 destroyed the rocket, the satellite mission it was preparing for, the launch pad that all future missions depended on, and put years of NASA, Amazon, and commercial contracts into immediate uncertainty. Whether Blue Origin survives it not as a company, but as the partner that NASA and the American space program needs it to be, depends on how quickly the pad can be rebuilt, how quickly investigators can identify and fix what went wrong, and how much time and patience the partners who were counting on New Glenn are willing to extend while they wait. That waiting has already begun, and the people waiting are not patient by nature, because what they are waiting for is, in one case, the internet service they were promised, and in another, the moon. Let us talk about satellites. Specifically, let us talk about what it costs to build 3,232 of them, book the rockets to carry them into orbit, and then watch the first rocket on your manifest detonate on the launch pad before a single one of your satellites has left the ground. Amazon's LEO broadband constellation, officially called Project LEO, styled as a direct competitor to SpaceX's Starlink network, is one of the most ambitious and expensive commercial infrastructure projects in the history of private enterprise. The idea behind it is straightforward in concept and staggering in execution. Put enough satellites in low Earth orbit to provide high-speed internet service to anyone on the planet, anywhere, at any time, regardless of whether they live in a city with fiber optic cables running under every street, or in a rural valley where the nearest cell tower is 40 miles away. Starlink has been doing this for several years now, and it has changed the calculus of global connectivity in ways that were not fully anticipated even by the people building it. Amazon looked at what Starlink was becoming and decided that the market was large enough for a second major player, and that they had both the financial resources and the logistics infrastructure to build one. 3,232 satellites. That is the full planned constellation. Not 3,000, not roughly 3,232, a number precise enough to reflect years of orbital mechanics, calculations, coverage modeling, regulatory filings with the Federal Communications Commission, and negotiations with launch providers around the world. Getting 3,232 satellites into the right orbits requires a great many rockets flying a great many times over a period of years, and Amazon had been assembling that launch manifest with the same methodical rigor that the company brings to the logistics of delivering packages to 150 million households. Blue Origin was the anchor of that manifest. 24 New Glenn launches, each carrying at least 48 satellites, meaning Blue Origin was contracted to deliver more than a third of the entire LEO constellation into orbit. The relationship was not incidental. Blue Origin and Amazon share a founder in Jeff Bezos, and the pairing of New Glenn with Project LEO was always understood as a strategic alignment as much as a commercial contract. The first of those 24 launches was the mission planned for approximately June 4th, 2026. The 48 satellites that were supposed to ride that mission were not on board the rocket during the static fire test. Amazon confirmed this immediately after the explosion. The satellites were safe. They were in a facility somewhere, waiting for a rocket that no longer existed and a launch pad that no longer functioned. Those 48 satellites will keep waiting. For how long? Nobody can say with certainty. The entire 24 launch manifest, every single one of those contracted Blue Origin flights was suspended with no resumption date the moment the pad went dark. Amazon confirmed that its LEO launch plans remained unchanged in the broadest sense, meaning the company still intends to complete the constellation, still intends to compete with Starlink, still intends to offer commercial service. Amazon had opened LEO beta access to enterprise customers in November 2025, and it was eyeing a full commercial launch in the third quarter of 2026. That timeline is now under pressure from a direction that no amount of internal planning could have anticipated or controlled. The math of the situation is worth working through slowly, because it illustrates exactly how dependent a large-scale satellite constellation deployment is on launch reliability. 3,232 satellites cannot be launched on a single rocket or even a handful of rockets. They must be launched in batches across dozens of missions over a period of years, with each batch placed in precise orbits that then need to be adjusted and maintained. The launch schedule is not a preference, it is a critical path. Delays in early launches cascade through the entire deployment schedule, pushing back the date when the constellation reaches the coverage threshold needed for commercial service, which pushes back revenue, which affects the business case for everything downstream. Amazon had other launch providers: Arianespace, United Launch Alliance with its Atlas V rocket, and eventually the Vulcan Centaur, but Blue Origin was carrying the heaviest load, and that load had just been dropped. Consider what United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rocket did the very night after the New Glenn explosion. On May the 29th, 2026, the morning after the fireball over Cape Canaveral, a United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket launched successfully from a different pad at the same space complex. carrying a different batch of Amazon LEO satellites into orbit. The commercial launch industry did not stop. Other pads at other companies kept working. The rockets that were not Blue Origin's kept flying, but those other launches, however successful, could not compensate for 24 missing New Glenn missions. The Atlas V carries fewer satellites per flight than New Glenn. The Vulcan Centaur, ULA's next-generation rocket, intended to replace the Atlas V, could carry more, but was not yet flying at the cadence that Amazon needed. Arianespace had its own manifest commitments. The launch market, already operating near capacity, was being asked to absorb a gap that Blue Origin was supposed to fill, and the market did not have that spare capacity sitting idle, waiting to be used. This is one of the realities of the modern commercial space industry that does not always make it into the public conversation about rockets and satellites. The global launch market is tight. There are only so many rockets. There are only so many pads. There are only so many engineers qualified to prepare and fly them. When a major vehicle goes offline, especially a vehicle that was carrying a disproportionate share of one customer's manifest, the ripple effects do not stay contained to that customer. They spread through the whole market, because the companies who might otherwise pick up the slack are already committed to their own manifests, their own customers, their own timelines. AST SpaceMobile felt this acutely. The company, which builds and operates large satellites designed to provide direct cellular broadband service to standard smartphones without any special hardware, effectively using satellites as cell towers in orbit, had been heavily reliant on New Glenn for its deployment plans. Each New Glenn launch could carry up to 8 of AST SpaceMobile's Block 2 Bluebird satellites, compared to only 3 on a Falcon 9. The difference in capacity per launch mattered enormously to a company trying to build a constellation quickly. AST SpaceMobile had already suffered a setback on the third New Glenn flight in April 2026, when a Bluebird satellite was lost due to the second stage anomaly. Now, with the launch pad gone, the company's goal of having 45 satellites in orbit by the end of 2026 was in serious jeopardy. The market responded immediately and honestly. Shares of AST SpaceMobile fell nearly 15% in trading on May the 29th. Investors who track the commercial space industry understand that launch risk is real risk, and that a destroyed launch pad is not an abstraction. It is a concrete, measurable constraint on how many satellites can be put into orbit in a given period of time, and it affects every company whose business model depends on those satellites being in orbit and operational. The AST SpaceMobile share drop was not panic. It was arithmetic. Blue Origin, for its part, said it was considering alternatives. The company vowed on June the 3rd to return New Glenn to flight by the end of 2026, an ambitious target that implied either a faster-than-expected pad rebuild, a rapid qualification of the California launch pad at Vandenberg, or some combination of both. The Vandenberg pad, Space Launch Complex 14, was under development, but not yet operational. Building out a new launch complex from the development stage to operational readiness in a matter of months, while simultaneously managing an accident investigation and planning a return to flight, would require a pace that stretched the boundaries of what the industry considered achievable. Nobody in the industry publicly called the year-end target impossible. Nobody publicly called it comfortable either. The suspended manifest was not merely an inconvenience for Amazon. It was a fundamental disruption to a deployment schedule that had already been running behind the timeline originally filed with regulators. The Federal Communications Commission, when it grants a satellite operator a license to build and operate a constellation, typically attaches milestone requirements deadlines by which a certain percentage of the constellation must be in orbit and operational, failing which the license can be challenged or revoked by competing applicants who argue that the spectrum is being warehoused rather than used. Amazon had been navigating those regulatory requirements carefully, and the LEO deployment had been proceeding, if not as fast as originally hoped. The New Glenn explosion added a new and significant obstacle to that navigation. Amazon confirmed publicly that no satellites had been integrated onto the rocket at the time of the explosion. That confirmation was important. It meant the financial loss from the explosion itself, from Amazon's perspective, was the launch contract and the opportunity cost of the delay rather than the physical destruction of hardware. But the 48 satellites that were built and ready to fly still needed to fly, and the rocket that was supposed to carry them was gone, and the pad it launched from was a ruin. The satellites would wait in storage, expensive, precision-engineered hardware sitting idle while the industry figured out how to reroute them. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the full strangeness of the commercial space industry's position in the year 2026. A decade ago, the idea of a single launch pad explosion disrupting the internet plans of one of the world's largest companies while simultaneously threatening the moon program of the world's largest space agency would have read as science fiction. The commercial space industry has grown so large, so interconnected, and so integrated into both government programs and everyday commercial infrastructure that a single night's failure at a single launch complex in Florida can pull on threads that reach from broadband internet service in rural Africa to the planned trajectory of the next American crewed lunar landing. The ecosystem has become sophisticated enough to accomplish extraordinary things. It has also become interdependent enough that a single catastrophic failure can send consequences cascading in directions that no single stakeholder had fully anticipated. Amazon's problem, viewed from the outside, looked like a schedule delay. Viewed from the inside, it was a restructuring problem of considerable complexity. 24 planned launches needed to be replaced, redistributed, or deferred across a launch market that had limited spare capacity. The satellites already built needed storage and maintenance. The satellites, not yet built, needed a revised production schedule that accounted for the changed launch timeline. The customers who had signed up for LEO beta access needed a revised timeline for when the constellation would be dense enough to deliver the service that had been promised. And all of this needed to happen while the company publicly maintained that its LEO launch plans remained unchanged. A statement that was technically accurate in the sense that the destination was unchanged, even as the path to get there had just become considerably more complicated. Meanwhile, in the background of all of this commercial turbulence, a much larger and more consequential question was working its way through the corridors of NASA headquarters and the offices of the people responsible for returning American astronauts to the surface of the moon for the first time in more than 50 years. The Artemis program is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most complex and expensive undertakings in the history of human spaceflight. Its goal to return humans to the lunar surface, establish a sustainable presence there, and eventually use the moon as a stepping stone toward crewed missions to Mars requires a constellation of hardware, contractors, timelines, and political commitments that must all align at the right moment. It requires a Space Launch System rocket powerful enough to send astronauts toward the moon. It requires an Orion crew capsule to carry them. It requires the Lunar Gateway space station in lunar orbit to serve as a waypoint. And it requires lunar landers vehicles capable of descending from lunar orbit to the surface and returning safely to orbit that are being built by two companies under separate contracts: SpaceX with its Starship vehicle and Blue Origin with its Blue Moon lander. Blue Moon is not a secondary participant in Artemis. It is one of two designated Human Landing System vehicles, meaning NASA has identified it as one of the two options for actually putting astronauts on the moon. Blue Origin holds a $3.4 billion contract for the Blue Moon Mark II crewed lander, the vehicle that would carry astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface. A smaller, uncrewed Blue Moon Mark I lander had been planned for a Moon Base 1 mission as soon as fall 2026. A second Blue Moon Mark I, carrying NASA's Viper lunar rover, was planned for 2027, and the crewed Artemis 4 moon landing itself was targeted for 2028. All of these vehicles launch on New Glenn. There is no alternative. Blue Moon was designed around New Glenn's payload capacity, its fairing dimensions, its trajectory capabilities. It cannot simply be transferred to a different rocket the way a passenger can transfer between airlines. The lander and the launch vehicle are engineered together, and the loss of the launch vehicle's only operational pad creates a cascading problem that extends all the way to the question of whether astronauts can land on the moon in this decade. NASA Administrator Isaacman was characteristically direct about this when he addressed it publicly. He said the agency was assessing near-term mission impacts and would provide timeline updates as information became available. He said 2028 was within the realm of a possible launchpad recovery timeline, and he said, in language that anyone paying attention understood as a frank acknowledgement of serious trouble, that the situation would take some serious time. Those words, "take some serious time," from the person running NASA about the launch pad that the moon program depends on, are not bureaucratic hedging. They are the measured, carefully chosen words of someone who has looked at the problem clearly and found it genuinely difficult. The Moon Base. One mission, planned for fall 2026, carrying the Blue Moon Mark I lander to the lunar surface. That mission is firmly in doubt, as one industry analysis put it, in the days after the explosion. It was always an aggressive timeline, with the launch pad gone and no resumption date for New Glenn flights. It is difficult to construct a credible scenario in which that mission flies in 2026. The timeline collapses backward from the pad. No pad means no launch. No launch means no lander on the moon. No lander on the moon means the Moon Base 1 mission does not happen on schedule. The Artemis 3 mission, currently targeted for mid-2027, intended as an Apollo 9-style low Earth orbit demonstration of the crewed lunar landers before an actual moon landing, requires Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II prototype to participate. If New Glenn is not flying by mid-2027, that mission timeline is compromised. And if Artemis 3 slips, Artemis 4, the crewed moon landing targeted for 2028, slips with it, because Artemis 4 cannot safely proceed without the demonstration and validation that Artemis 3 is designed to provide. The entire downstream sequence of NASA's lunar ambitions was sitting on a foundation that included, as one of its two essential pillars, a rocket whose only launch pad was now a debris field in Florida. The other pillar, SpaceX's Starship, had its own complications. Starship had conducted a test flight on May the 22nd, 2026, just 6 days before the New Glenn explosion. That test had gone relatively well by Starship's own developmental standards, but relatively well for a vehicle still in active development is not the same as ready to support crewed lunar landings on a fixed NASA timeline. SpaceX's Starship Human Landing System variant, the version designed to carry astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface, still had significant development and qualification work ahead of it. NASA had already been aware that depending on a single landing system contractor carried risk, which was part of why they had contracted both SpaceX and Blue Origin in the first place. 2 landing system contractors meant redundancy. It meant that if one hit delays, the other could potentially pick up the critical path. But that redundancy only works if both contractors are actually capable of flying. With New Glenn grounded and Blue Moon's launch manifest suspended, the redundancy had effectively collapsed to 1, and the one remaining option was a vehicle that was itself still deep in its own development process. Former Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy had issued a warning to both companies in October 2025, serving briefly as NASA's acting administrator at the time, indicating that NASA may use Blue Origin's lander to return humans to the Moon as soon as 2028 if SpaceX's lander fell too far behind schedule. That statement was made when both companies were still on track, more or less, and it was intended as a message to SpaceX not to fall behind. Now, the situation was reversed. Blue Origin's lander had lost its rocket, and SpaceX was suddenly carrying even more of the weight of America's lunar ambitions than it had been before. The commercial and institutional consequences of the May the 28th explosion were not limited to the 2 companies most directly affected. The broader launch market felt the tremor. Rocket Lab, which operates smaller vehicles and cannot carry New Glenn-scale payloads, was unaffected directly, but would benefit indirectly from any satellite customer who needed to find alternative launch capacity for smaller payloads. United Launch Alliance, whose Atlas V had launched successfully the very night after the explosion, was in the unusual position of being able to absorb some Amazon LEO missions, but at lower satellite per launch capacity than New Glenn provided. Arianespace's Ariane 6 rocket, Europe's heavy-lift vehicle, was part of Amazon's diverse launch portfolio and would carry some share of the constellation. But none of these alternatives, individually or combined, could fully replace the 24 New Glenn missions that were now suspended indefinitely. The most unsettling aspect of the commercial fallout was not the immediate disruption. Disruptions happen. Schedules slip. Timelines are revised. The most unsettling aspect was the structural fragility. It revealed the degree to which an ambitious commercial space program had been built on an assumption of New Glenn reliability that the rocket had not yet had time to fully earn. Blue Origin had conducted 3 flights. The vehicle was less than a year and a half into its operational life. It had already experienced a second-stage failure on its 3rd mission, and an enormous amount of critical infrastructure, commercial satellite deployments, NASA lunar missions. The entire Blue Moon program had been stacked on top of it. Not because Blue Origin was careless, or because NASA was naive, but because the alternative was to wait indefinitely for certainty that the nature of rocket development never provides. and the programs that needed to fly could not afford to wait forever. Now they were waiting anyway, and the question that everyone in the room was trying not to ask too loudly because asking it acknowledged a vulnerability that nobody had the power to fix quickly was whether the 2028 crewed moon landing was still a realistic target, or whether the explosion of May the 28th, 2026 had quietly pushed that date out of reach. Nobody gave a definitive answer. The investigation was ongoing. The pad assessment was ongoing. The timeline for Blue Origin's return to flight was unconfirmed. The Artemis program continued to insist on its targets, while privately acknowledging that those targets had become considerably harder to hit. And somewhere in a facility in the Pacific Northwest, 48 Amazon Leo satellites sat in storage, built and ready and waiting for a rocket that no longer had a place to stand. 6 days after the explosion, Blue Origin made a promise. On June the 3rd, 2026, the company announced publicly that it intended to resume New Glenn flights by the end of the year, by year's end. That meant within approximately 7 months of the night, the sky over Cocoa Beach turned orange. It meant a launch pad investigation, cleanup, damage assessment, engineering, redesign, rebuild, requalification, and return to flight review. A process that had taken SpaceX 15 months after a smaller explosion at a pad where the company had substantial prior experience, all accomplished in roughly half that time by a company that had been operating its only orbital pad for less than a year and a half. The aerospace industry received this announcement with what might charitably be described as respectful skepticism. Nobody called it impossible in public. The culture of the commercial space industry does not tend toward public declarations of impossibility. The entire enterprise is built on the belief that things previously considered impossible can be made possible through sufficient engineering effort and financial commitment. But nobody called it comfortable either. The people who had rebuilt launch pads before, who had managed the forensic and structural complexity of cleaning up a pad explosion while simultaneously preserving evidence for an accident investigation, understood what Blue Origin was committing to. They understood the scalpel not bulldozer reality of the early weeks. They understood that the pad systems specific to New Glenn, the cryogenic propellant infrastructure, the flame trench, the hold-down systems, the electrical and data umbilicals could not be sourced from a catalog and installed in an afternoon. They understood that every major component would need to be re-engineered, refabricated, reinstalled, and tested before a single drop of liquid methane was allowed near the new infrastructure. Whether Blue Origin meets its year-end commitment will be one of the defining questions of the near-term commercial space industry. If it does, if the company manages to identify the root cause of the explosion, fix it, rebuild the pad, requalify the vehicle, and fly again before January 1st, 2027, it will be one of the more remarkable recoveries in the history of launch vehicle development. It will demonstrate an organizational and engineering capacity that many in the industry had not yet seen Blue Origin demonstrate at that scale. And it will matter enormously to NASA, to Amazon, and to every other stakeholder whose plans were interrupted on May the 28th. If it does not, if the year-end target slips to mid-2027, or to late 2027, or into 2028, then the consequences described in the previous chapter of this story do not merely persist, they compound. Every month that New Glenn does not fly is another month that Amazon's Leo constellation falls further behind its deployment schedule. Every month that Blue Moon cannot launch is another month that NASA's Artemis timeline, already under pressure from the complexities of Starship development on the SpaceX side, loses margin, and lost margin in a program with fixed congressional funding, fixed international partner commitments, and a stated national goal of returning humans to the moon before any other nation does, is not an abstraction. It is a real and measurable erosion of the political and institutional will that keeps those programs alive. Space programs are not purely technical enterprises. They are also political ones. They require sustained public investment, which requires sustained political support, which requires the perception of forward momentum. When programs stall, when launch dates slip, when hardware is destroyed, when the stated timeline recedes faster than the actual work can chase it, the political consensus that funds them begins to fray. Not immediately, and not always, but the relationship between schedule, performance, and institutional durability in large space programs is real and documented. The Apollo program's remarkable pace in the 1960s was in part a product of the Cold War urgency that made congressional support nearly impossible to withdraw. The Space Shuttle program's long delays in development in the 1970s eroded some of that urgency before the first flight eventually restored it. The Constellation program, NASA's previous effort to return humans to the moon, cancelled in 2010, lost political support, in part because its schedules were slipping and its costs were rising faster than the results were materializing. Artemis has survived its own share of schedule pressure. The Space Launch System rocket that forms the core of the program took longer and cost more to develop than originally planned. Artemis 1, the first uncrewed test flight of the full Artemis stack, did not launch until November 2022, years behind its original target. Artemis 2, carrying a crew on a lunar flyby without landing, was still working toward its launch date in 2026 at the time of the New Glenn explosion. The program has continued despite those delays, in part because the hardware is real, the progress is visible, and the international partnerships, including commitments from the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, create obligations that make cancellation politically costly. But every major setback adds weight to the argument made by critics of the program's approach, budget, and timeline. The New Glenn explosion added a new weight. It did not break the structure, but it was not light. The competitive dimension of the situation is impossible to ignore, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. China's lunar program, the Chang'e series of robotic missions leading toward the stated goal of crewed Chinese lunar landings in the early 2030s, is proceeding on its own schedule, unaffected by what happens at Cape Canaveral. China has its own heavy-lift rockets. It has its own lander development programs. It has a stated national commitment to establishing a presence on the moon that has so far been backed by consistent investment and consistent technical progress. The competitive framing of the American return to the moon, the idea that the United States needs to establish a sustainable lunar presence before China does, both for scientific and strategic reasons, is one of the principal arguments that has kept Artemis politically viable. That framing is most effective when American programs are visibly making progress. It is least effective when American programs are visibly absorbing setbacks. The explosion of May the 28th, 2026 was not, by itself, enough to change the trajectory of that competition. A single launch pad explosion, however consequential, does not define the outcome of a multi-year, multi-program, multinational effort to return humans to another world. But it is a data point, and in the minds of the people responsible for making the case to Congress and to the public that the Artemis program deserves continued support, data points matter. This is part of why the response from NASA Administrator Isaacman was so carefully calibrated. He acknowledged the difficulty honestly. Spaceflight is unforgiving without catastrophizing. He confirmed the impact was real. The agency was assessing near-term mission consequences without specifying exactly which missions were in danger of which specific delays. He placed the explosion in the broader context of the inherent risk of developing new heavy-lift launch capability, framing it not as a failure of Blue Origin specifically, but as a reminder of the difficulty of the work in general. That framing was both accurate and politically useful because it preserved the coalition, NASA, Blue Origin, SpaceX, international partners, without assigning blame that could fracture relationships, that the program still needed to be functional. Now consider what comes next for Blue Origin as a company, independent of the Artemis timeline and the Amazon manifest. Blue Origin was founded by Jeff Bezos in the year 2000. For most of its existence, it operated in comparative obscurity, developing its New Shepard suborbital tourism vehicle and its B-4 engine, while SpaceX dominated the public conversation about commercial spaceflight. New Glenn's development took years longer than originally announced, and the rocket's first flight in January 2025 came after a long period during which the industry had grown accustomed to treating Blue Origin as a company that was always nearly ready to launch. The first flight changed that narrative significantly. The second flight reinforced it. The third flight, which ended in a second-stage failure, was a setback, but a manageable one, of the kind that all developing launch vehicles experience during the early phase of their operational life. The explosion of the fourth vehicle during a ground test is a different category of setback, not because it calls into question the fundamental engineering of New Glenn in a way that a specific in-flight anomaly might not the root cause of the explosion could turn out to be something relatively contained, a specific component or system that can be addressed without redesigning the vehicle itself. But because of what it does to the company's credibility and timeline, at precisely the moment when credibility and timeline were the most valuable things Blue Origin possessed, Blue Origin, in the spring of 2026, was a company on the cusp of becoming what it had always intended to be: a significant, reliable, regularly launching, orbital launch provider capable of competing with SpaceX across multiple market segments. It had a real rocket. It had real customers. It had NASA contracts worth billions of dollars. It had a lunar lander program with genuine technical merit and genuine political backing. It had a commercial satellite deployment manifest that, if executed, would make it one of the primary delivery mechanisms for one of the largest satellite internet networks in the world. Everything it needed to become consequential was in place, or nearly in place. And then the launch pad was gone. The question of what Blue Origin does now, not in the next 6 months, not in the next year, but in the next 5 years, is genuinely open. The company has the financial resources of one of the world's wealthiest individuals behind it. Jeff Bezos has committed enormous personal capital to Blue Origin over many years, absorbing the slow pace of development and the delayed timelines without retreating from the mission. That financial backing remains. The money to rebuild the pad, to accelerate the Vandenberg development, to continue the Blue Moon Lander program. That money exists, and there is no credible reason to believe it will be withdrawn because of a single, however devastating, ground test failure. But money is not the only resource that matters in this situation. Time matters, and trust matters. The companies that had booked New Glenn flights, Amazon, AST Space Mobile, and others had made commitments based on a schedule that Blue Origin had provided, and that schedule is now uncertain in ways that affect their own business plans. Trust, once tested, requires demonstrated performance to rebuild. Blue Origin will need to fly successfully, regularly, reliably, on schedule, over a sustained period before the commercial market treats it with the same confidence that a more established launch provider commands. The path back to that confidence runs through the rebuild. The physical rebuild of Launch Complex 36 is not just an engineering project. It is a demonstration of organizational capacity. Can Blue Origin manage a complex, time-pressured rebuild while simultaneously running an accident investigation, continuing lander development, and maintaining relationships with customers and government partners who are waiting for answers? The answer to that question will tell the industry more about Blue Origin's maturity as a space company than any number of successful launches would have. The Vandenberg Pad Space Launch Complex 14 takes on new urgency in this environment. If Blue Origin can bring that pad to operational readiness faster than the Cape Canaveral rebuild, it provides a path to resuming New Glenn flights from the West Coast while the Florida infrastructure is reconstructed. West Coast launches from Vandenberg are optimized for certain orbit inclinations, primarily polar and sun-synchronous orbits, used for Earth observation and some communication satellites, rather than the lower inclination equatorial orbits that the Florida pad is better suited for. The Amazon Leo constellation requires launches from Florida for its planned orbit configuration, but any New Glenn flight from any pad would be valuable in demonstrating return to flight and rebuilding the reliability record that the program needs. A successful Vandenberg launch would not solve the Amazon problem or the Artemis problem directly, but it would prove that New Glenn is still flying, that the vehicle is trustworthy, and that Blue Origin is capable of operating under pressure. It is worth stepping back here as Part 4 demands, and as the nature of this story requires, and sitting with what this moment actually means, not just for Blue Origin, or for NASA, or for Amazon, but for the larger project of becoming a civilization that regularly and reliably travels beyond Earth. Every era of spaceflight has had its defining disasters. The disasters do not define the era. They reveal something true about the difficulty of the work. And then the work continues. The Apollo 1 fire of January the 27th, 1967, 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, killed in a launch pad fire during a routine ground test, the same category of test that destroyed New Glenn almost 60 years later, did not end the Apollo program. It forced a painful and comprehensive redesign of the command module, delayed the first crewed Apollo flight by nearly 2 years, and extracted an enormous human cost. But it also produced a safer vehicle, and that safer vehicle carried 12 human beings to the surface of the moon. The fire did not stop the moon landings. The fire made the moon landings possible in the form they ultimately took, because the engineering that came out of that investigation was better than the engineering that would have flown without it. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of January the 28th, 1986, a launch failure, not a ground test, but a catastrophic loss during what was intended as a routine operational mission, grounded the shuttle program for nearly 3 years, killed 7 crew members, and fundamentally changed how NASA thought about risk, schedule pressure, and the culture of decision-making. The investigation that followed, led by the Rogers Commission, produced findings that reshaped not just the shuttle program, but the entire culture of human spaceflight risk management. The Challenger disaster was not the end of the shuttle program. It was the moment that forced the program to become honest about the risks it had been accepting without fully acknowledging them. The SpaceX Falcon 9 pad explosion of September 1st, 2016, destroyed a rocket, destroyed a $200 million satellite, and put a launch pad out of commission for 15 months. It also led SpaceX to completely redesign its helium pressurization system, eliminating the class of failure that caused the explosion. The Falcon 9 that returned to flight in January 2017 was a better rocket than the one that exploded in September 2016. Not because the explosion was good, but because the investigation that followed it was thorough, and the fixes that came out of it were real. This is the pattern, not consolation, not cliché, the actual documented pattern of how rocket programs develop. Catastrophic failures reveal weaknesses that were present but invisible. Investigations make those weaknesses visible. Engineering fixes the weakness. The vehicle that returns to flight after a serious failure is typically more reliable than the vehicle that would have continued flying without encountering that failure, because the failure forced the engineering to confront something it had not previously been forced to confront. This does not make the explosions acceptable. It does not justify the costs, financial, temporal, programmatic, that they impose. The 48 Amazon satellites sitting in storage are not sitting there because of progress. The Blue Moon lander program is not in jeopardy because of progress. The 2028 Artemis timeline is not under pressure because of progress. These are real costs, imposed by a real failure, with real consequences for real people and real programs. But it does mean that the explosion of May the 28th, 2026 is not the end of the New Glenn story. It is a chapter in it, a brutal, expensive, and consequential chapter, but a chapter. The investigation will find the root cause. The engineers will fix it. The pad will be rebuilt. The rocket will fly again, not on the original schedule, not without cost, but it will fly. The more interesting question, the one that the explosion raises but cannot itself answer, is what kind of spaceflight program emerges from this moment. The American approach to reaching the moon in this era is fundamentally different from the approach of the 1960s. Apollo was a government program, funded and directed entirely by NASA, with a single architecture and a single critical path. If something went wrong, and things went wrong, NASA fixed it, because NASA owned everything and controlled everything. The Artemis program, by contrast, is a public-private partnership that depends on commercial companies developing and operating critical hardware on timelines and to specifications that are partly their own. That approach has enormous advantages. It leverages private capital, private innovation, and the competitive dynamics of a commercial market in ways that a purely government program cannot. But it also means that NASA's critical path runs through companies it does not fully control, whose hardware it does not own, whose schedules it cannot dictate. When a commercial partner has a launch pad fire, NASA can assess the impact and adjust its plans. It cannot rebuild the launch pad itself. The explosion of New Glenn has renewed a quiet debate within the spaceflight policy community about the degree of redundancy that NASA requires in its critical path hardware. The Human Landing System Dual award the decision to contract both SpaceX and Blue Origin for lunar landers was explicitly designed to provide that redundancy. But redundancy in the landing system does not provide redundancy in the launch vehicle if both landing systems launch on different rockets. Starship lands on Starship, Blue Moon lands on New Glenn. If New Glenn is grounded, Blue Moon cannot fly regardless of the lander's own development status. The landing system redundancy and the launch vehicle redundancy are separate layers of the same problem, and the explosion of May the 28th exposed the gap between them. What the future of Artemis looks like in the specific context of a grounded New Glenn depends on how quickly three things happen. The root cause investigation concludes and produces actionable findings. The pad rebuild proceeds at or near the pace Blue Origin has committed to, and the Vandenberg pad reaches operational status as an alternative launch site. If all three of those things happen at the optimistic end of their respective timelines, the Artemis program loses time but does not lose viability. The 2028 crewed moon landing, while under real pressure, remains within reach. If any of those three things take significantly longer than the optimistic timeline, if the root cause turns out to be deeper and more systemic than a single component failure, if the PAS rebuild encounters structural complications that push it into 2028, if the Vandenberg pad development faces its own delays, then the arithmetic of the Artemis schedule becomes considerably harder to defend. And if the arithmetic becomes hard enough to defend, the political and institutional will to defend it will face its own test. Space is not a race in the sense that it ends. No one crosses a finish line and the game stops. But human spaceflight programs do have moments when they either demonstrate enough progress to maintain the coalition of support they need, or they lose enough momentum that the coalition begins to fracture. The Apollo 1 fire nearly broke the program. Instead, it forged it. The question that the explosion of New Glenn ultimately poses, not to Blue Origin, not to NASA, not to Amazon, but to anyone who watches human beings try to reach beyond the atmosphere, is whether this fire, like the ones that came before it, becomes the thing that makes the program that survived it stronger than the program that went into it. The history of spaceflight says yes. The history of spaceflight says that the programs which encounter catastrophic failure and respond with honesty, thoroughness, and genuine engineering change tend to come out of those failures better than they went in. The history of spaceflight also says that the programs which encounter catastrophic failure and respond with schedule pressure, incomplete investigation, and inadequate fix tend to encounter catastrophic failure again. Which kind of response follows the explosion of May the 28th, 2026 is not yet known. The investigation is still running. The pad is still a debris field. The timeline is still uncertain. The outcome is genuinely open in a way that only time and engineering and organizational will can resolve. What is already known is simpler and more durable than any of those uncertainties. It is the thing that the fireball over Cape Canaveral confirmed, not for the first time, and not for the last, that the distance between Earth and space is short in miles and vast in difficulty, that the machines capable of crossing it carry energies that demand respect, and that every generation that has tried to cross that distance has had its nights when the launch pad caught fire, and its mornings when the engineers came back. The builders always come back. Not because they are fearless, but because the work is not finished, and they know it is not finished, and they go back to the only place where the work can actually be done: the launch pad, the drawing board, the investigation report, and eventually, inevitably, the next rocket, standing ready. In the Florida night, Blue Origin's next rocket will stand on that pad eventually. The date is uncertain. The path is difficult. The stakes for the people waiting on it, the satellite engineers, the astronaut crews training for Artemis missions, the program managers running timelines backward from their target dates, are enormous and real. But the path exists. The work continues. And the universe, indifferent as ever, keeps its own schedule regardless of what happens on the ground. Rest now until our next voyage.